How do you write a Docker file for an ASP.NET Core application? Stick around as I'll show you how to write one and how you can run your ASP.NET Core app from it. Remember to hit the subscribe button. This is the application we're going to be Dockerizing. It's an ASP.NET Core web API and it has references to two class libraries, the application and the infrastructure. The infrastructure class library also has a reference to the application class library. Writing a Docker file involves using a build image with software already pre-installed. We want to ensure that the .NET SDK is installed. We can go to mcr.microsoft.com and we can do a search for SDK. We're going to select the .NET SDK build image. And this is the URL that we want to be using to get our build image. To create a Docker file, we go into our ASP.NET Core Web API project. We'll create a new file and we're going to call it Dockerfile with a capital D. From there, we want to set some arguments before we start. We're going to set an argument of .NET_version. We're going to be using .NET version 9.0, so we're going to set that argument. We're also going to set an argument of build_configuration, and we're going to set that as release. And the first thing we want to do is we want to get the build image. If we go back to the Microsoft artifact registry, this is the image that we want to use, so we're going to copy that. Then we're going to call from and paste that into there. I'm going to make some changes here. We're going to set that to the argument. So to do that, we call $, and then .NET version. We're also going to give it an alias of build. From there, we want to set the work directory as source. If we have a look at our project, we want to be copying the files from these class libraries and also the ASP.NET Core Web API into our build. To do that, we call the copy command, then we type out the libraries / round the code docker sample.application. So this will be from our machine and we want to copy it into our build. We want to do the same now for the infrastructure. So we'll copy and paste that and we'll change the application to infrastructure. We also want to do the same for the web API. So once again, we copy that, but we need to change a couple of things. So the project's in web and the project is called roundthecode.dockersample.webapi. So we change it there and we copy and paste it into there as well. Afterwards, we want to set the web directory so it's pointed to the web API. We can do that by calling work_dir, and then it's now been copied into source/web/roundthecode.dockersample.webapi. We then want to restore any new get packages that are needed to build the application. We call the run command and then we run .NET space restore. The csproj file is called roundthecode.dockersample.webapi.csproj. After we've done that, we want to build the project. So we change the .NET command to build the same csproj file. We want to add a couple of parameters to it. So we want to set the configuration to release. So we've got the argument up there. So we call it by calling $build_configuration. And we want to publish the files into a folder called app/build. So we use the O parameter for that. Finally, we want to publish the project. So we call .NET space publish, and we can copy and paste the commands from the build and change a couple of things. We want to publish it into a folder called /app/publish. And we can be specific about the runtime version that we want to use. We have a number of runtime versions that we can use. We're going to use this one here. And the reason being is that it's a lightweight distribution, which will be handy for file sizes. So we go and paste that in there. We just need to make sure that the configuration is wrapped with quotes around it. So far, we've used the .NET SDK image to build and publish our application. But we don't want to run our application from that image because of the file size. Instead, we want to use the runtime image. How do we go about doing that? If we go back onto the Microsoft artifact registry, we're going to do a search for ASP.NET Core runtime. We want to use this image here. We go into the about, That's the image that we wish to pull. Back in our Docker file, we're going to call that image. Now we're going to change the version, so we're going to call our argument of .NET version, and we're going to call our image as run. So now this is a separate build, and this will now be a separate run. We're going to set the work directory so it goes to the /app. Now we're going to copy the published files from the build into the run. To do that, we call --from equals build. So we're copying it from the build. And inside the build, we published our files into a folder called /app/publish. We're copying the files from /app/publish into /app in the run. To do that, we just add a dot, and that's done for us. Then we set the entry point to run the application. So we call the .NET command, and the file for the application is roundthecode.dockersample.webapi.dll. And that's our Docker file created. To run the Docker file, you need to have the Docker CLI installed on your machine. If you're a Windows user, you can either install Docker Desktop or Rancher Desktop onto your machine. If you're using Docker Desktop on Windows, you need to make sure that WSL is installed on your machine. To do that, you go into the control panel and you look for Programs and Features. You go to Turn Windows Features on or off, and you look for Windows Subsystem for Linux. If it's not ticked, tick the box and it will install it for you. With the Docker CLI installed, we can now build the Docker file. This is how we do it. We want to make a note of the directory where the Docker file is. In Folder Explorer, we'll copy the folder. We can see that the Docker file is there. We'll open up a terminal window, run cd, paste the folder path, and that's changed it for us. To run the Docker file, we call docker space build, then we call the -f parameter, which stands for file string, and the file is Dockerfile, so that's what we put in there. Then we call the -t parameter, and this stands for tag name. We can call this whatever we want. We're going to call it roundthecode.dockersample.webapi, and we can give it a version number, so we separate it with a colon and give it a version number of 1.0. Lastly, we need to run it 2 folders back. If we go back into the directory where our Docker file is, if we go 2 folders back, we want to ensure that the libraries and the web are able to be copied into our images. Therefore, that's the reason why we need to do that. Let's now run the command. And that has successfully completed. To run the Docker file, we call docker space run, and we can specify the port number. So we want to run the application on 38080. The container port by default, if you're running .NET 8 or later, is 8080. So that is the Docker container port, and that's the port where we want to be running our application on our machine. Then we just specify the tag for it, so we called it roundthecode.dockersample.webapi, and it was version 1.0. Now that's running on 8080 for our Docker container. Let's have a look and see if it's running on our machine. The application is running on localhost :38080. It's a basic web API. We can just test out the request. So we can give it an ID of 22, and we're getting a response there. To reduce the size of your Docker file, you can run the Alpine Linux distribution, which is more of a lightweight distribution. To do that, you append a hyphen and just add Alpine to it. The next stages after this is to create a CI pipeline, run your Docker file, and upload it to a container image registry. Watch this video next to find out how you can create a CI pipeline in Azure DevOps. And let me know in the YouTube comments whether you're Dockerizing your applications and how you go about doing it.